next we have a fireside chat with Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs and the President's envoy for Northern Ireland in 2007. She's currently a senior fellow in the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy Belfer Center. And our moderator is Dr. Carlos Díaz-Rosillo, Director of the FIU Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. He was the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere. Ambassador Dobriansky, Carlos, welcome.
Zero.
I thought, but
Tons of chairs. Choose one.
choose this one.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here. I was thinking about how to introduce the ambassador and how to capture so many years of outstanding service to our country. And we have half an hour, so we can spend the entire half an hour going over her many accomplishments. So I'll do so in the way that I introduced former Vice President Mike Pence when he came to the center a few weeks ago. He said that he wanted to be introduced using 3 words. In that case, it was very easy because in his book, he told us what the 3 words were. It's a little harder for the ambassador because it's really difficult to do 3 words. So I'm gonna do 3 phrases, if you don't mind. And you'll tell me if I captured your career in those 3 phrases. So it is really an honor to introduce Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, an accomplished public servant, an internationally renowned foreign policy expert, and I mean that, recognized not just in the United States, but around the world, and a true American patriot. So thank you for being here. I'm actually gonna do a 4th one. I'm already breaking my own rules. A great friend, a great colleague, and a former senior leadership fellow at the center, and now a member of our board of advisors. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time and for being here with us. I'm gonna jump right into it and ask you a few questions. This is a conference on hemispheric security, and there are many challenges facing our hemisphere. If you had to pick the most serious challenge facing us, what would that be?
Carlos, I'll answer it, but first, good morning to all of you. I'm delighted to be here at the 8th annual FIU Hemispheric Conference, and just congratulations, just delighted to be here on campus. What is the #1 challenge in the region? Well, we just heard Dusty Erickson give about, I think, 8, but I would put it in 1, and that is the hemisphere, and not just the hemisphere, but the global community at large is confronted with great power competition. Russia, China, especially in the context of the region, has come in politically, economically, militarily, and it does pose a very direct challenge to our national security interests.
And you would put Russia and China on the same level?
China certainly, I would say, is viewed economically as being the more significant challenge for the region, absolutely. But the reason why I pause is because right now it's Russia, though, that has the nuclear weapons. Russia has been giving China aid and assistance in bolstering its own military foundation. But I think we need to remind ourselves of also that fact. Although most in the foreign policy community, they'll always add the word, well, China is the challenge and Russia's the junior partner. Moscow doesn't like that at all.
All right. We have a number of people in the room who are either currently involved in our policy towards the hemisphere or who were at one point. What have we gotten right in our policy towards the Americans, and what have we gotten wrong?
I think one of the most significant areas for the United States in collaborating with the region has been in the economic and specifically the trade area. I'm always struck by the fact that regardless of the particular bent of a regime, that nevertheless, there's been a kind of practical or approach. I think of, for example, in the case of Uruguay, and in terms of the kind of political shifts that the government of Uruguay has had over the years. I remember, in fact, during the time of Vasquez, that, and there were two periods, but he was very specific and very focused on free trade and trade with the United States. And I think there was a strong collaboration, although there were many differences in other sectors. So I would pick out the economic domain, the trade aspect of what I think has been beneficial to not only to the United States, but to the region at large. More could be done in that area. And as we've witnessed in recent time, there have been some sort of ebbs and flows on that and stalls. I think that that's a key area for growth and for innovation and for literally improving and strengthening the relationship.
Now, I think that for far too long, despite the best of intentions, the U.S. has ignored Latin America or not paid enough attention. Why is that? Or first, do you agree? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Well, I'm glad you asked me if I do agree. I agree 100%. I've been in government for something like over 30 years. My area has not been predominantly this area, but I have to say it has been disheartening the fact that we have not prioritized the region. I think that we should prioritize the region. And I've actually been part of in government and out of government groups that work to putting this front and center. I will say during the time of my last tenure in government, which was under George W. Bush, you may remember that he campaigned on the importance of the region, and actually the very first trip that he took was to Mexico. And then, okay, what happened? What happened was later, 9/11, the whole focus on terrorism and counterterrorism strategies. I could say for my own work then as Undersecretary of Global Affairs at the State Department, a lot of my work was put over here. And yes, we had to fight to get us front and center. I had global issues, transnational issues. But to the point, why you asked the question, well, that's an example where there was actually a formal statement, a formal desire, but you can't predict what happens in terms of challenges globally and what you need to do to address it. I will say, at least during that period, a silver lining was the fact that we collaborated with many countries in and throughout Latin America. And I think, and out throughout the hemisphere at large. And I think that that was important and to good effect. I remember in particular, there were meetings in Washington that were focused on our operations in Afghanistan. And there were many Latin American ambassadors who were there, present, engaged. But the biggest criticism I have, and yes, I would agree with you, is that has not been front and center. Why is it? Either it has been derailed, as in that case, even with good intentions, because of other geopolitical challenges, factors that needed a all hands on deck. And as you know, that did for, over a decade. I would also add that I think that just, there's the issue of we have the Organization of American States, but in terms of Europe and the transatlantic relationship, we have a military alliance. And so there's engagement in so many ways. It's very strong across the board, but there's no excuse for it. And when you ask me what's the reason, there isn't a single reason, but the answer is there's no excuse for it.
And I would
100%.
say, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can pay attention to the big threats,
Totally.
Immediate threats, and also to what's happening in the hemisphere.
Totally. If all of you may remember, this doesn't relate per se to the hemisphere, but I remember actually at the time in the Obama administration, there was an announcement that we were going to do a reset on our policy toward Asia. By the way, the criticism also at that time was, why are we doing a reset towards Asia? Well, what happened to our transatlantic relationship, our military ties, our economic ties, and other areas? You're absolutely right. And I'll underscore it, there's no reason as to why this should not be front and center, and we should be able to walk, chew, and gum at the same time. We should be able to deal effectively politically, economically, militarily, just across the board with the region.
So if you have one piece of advice for changing that, what would that be? How do we refocus so that we can walk and chew gum at the same time?
Well, I would like to see, and we're coming into 2024, by the way, I would like to see an incoming president make Latin America the first visit, number one. Number two, I think that in the trade space, there's still a lot that remains and can be done, whether it's bilaterally or for that matter, in terms of multiple countries, as we've seen. I know during my time, again, at the time of the George W. Bush administration, we had focused on the trade agreements of all of Central America, which was a particular approach, the Central American trade agreements. So I'd like to see that domain. I also think there are so many issues in which we can be collaborating on together. And it doesn't have to be only impacting the area. When I think again, I'm going to mention DASD, you had mentioned a number of areas. You had mentioned also the importance, which I know is important to this administration and previous administrations, is climate and environment. I know that the region is very concerned about that. I know that I dealt with areas like tuna dolphin, certain kinds of fishing issues that were also of relevance and key to the region. So, there are strategic, crucial issues that impact all of our not only our national security foundation, but I would also say there are other areas that also affect our security at large. Energy is another key area that I would pick out. I mean, I can go on with that list, but I would like to see a more robust agenda. I'd like to see a visit right at the beginning, which makes a statement. You're our neighbors, you're important to us, we're together.
I think that would be terrific. If you don't mind, let me just briefly turn our attention to an area of the world where you are really a world expert, Russia and Ukraine. There are many people in the United States, including some policymakers, a lot of them in Congress, who argue that what's happening in Ukraine is awful. We understand that it's important, but that there are a lot of serious issues in this country. What do you tell somebody who again, theoretically gets the importance of getting involved, but argues that we have a lot of issues in this country? Why spend so much time, effort, and money in a conflict that is so far away from us?
Well, to put it very simply, what we're witnessing in terms of this, as it's defined, unprovoked, blatant, brutal, egregious aggression on the independent, sovereign country of Ukraine is outrageous in this century and in this day and age. It's outrageous, and you cannot just sit back and let it stand. If you do, you basically are undermining the very international order and rules and standards that we live by. And if you let it go and you turn your head away from it and you're not engaged in taking action, concrete action against it, well, what you're saying is it doesn't really matter. And you're also giving a pass to those countries that are authoritarian and are looking for that opportunity to have an excuse and say, well, it was done there, and we're going to move forward and we're going to undertake aggression elsewhere. We hear a lot of the focus on China. In fact, I just was in Tokyo, and the Prime Minister of Japan gave at Johns Hopkins University a very, very strong speech in which he said, Ukraine is far from us. But he said, what's happening in Ukraine is so relevant to us in Japan and in Asia, because we are concerned about the military buildup of China, and also not just the military buildup, but the fact that the Chinese and Xi Jinping has stated outright, we plan to go and take Taiwan. Taiwan is ours. It's ours. It's been stated. And we should remind ourselves, Putin, by the way, back at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, he actually laid it out what he intended to do. He actually said, we have a right to go into other countries where there are ethnic Russians or Russian-speaking populations, and Western values are not our values, and this is what we're going to do. So here, bluntly speaking, if we do not take action, and here, The action is providing assistance to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have not asked for Latins to come in, Americans to come in, Asians to come in. No, on the contrary, they said, just give us the military foundation from which we can be able to push back the Russian troops on our sovereign territory, and we can be independent and be respected as an independent nation.
So then following up, are we doing enough? Should we do more?
I personally think, first, I commend the administration on forging a very strong alliance structure. And that's important because there have been those that have said and questioned, why should we be there? And I'm speaking of around the globe. And in this context, in Europe, I think that the transatlantic relationship is a strong one on this. Will it stay that way over time? That remains to be seen. But right now, there are varying degrees of support, but yet it's unified in terms of the mission. I would like to see us state actually the result of the mission that should be more clear, and that is that we want success in Ukraine, that we want a victory in Ukraine, and we want to see Russian troops pushed back or out of and off of Ukrainian territory.
So what does success look like?
So towards that end, if I can just say, towards that end, they've specifically have asked, particularly for air cover. And that is something that has been addressed in recent time. If I had to put, because you asked a criticism, it's a criticism of, I wish that things moved faster. And now the Ukrainians want to move forward with a counteroffensive. In order to achieve that and achieve it successfully, they need it now. They need the materials now. So in terms of, I said the alliance, I think that's a strong point. Secondly, I think that we have been giving them the kind of support that they need and the backing and the materials, but it needs to be, in my view, faster and some of the more up-to-date equipment, they need it now. Yes, it requires training, but they are getting training. It's taking a little bit of time, but they're getting training in Germany in particular.
So the U.S. has the resources to get involved and to provide assistance to Ukraine.
Yes.
Latin American countries don't necessarily. How can they be involved? What would you like to see from the leaders in the hemisphere outside the United States? How can they be helpful? What should they do?
By the way, there's political, economic, and military support. And in this regard, I have to say I was gratified in looking at the voting record of this recent time. One was last month in March, and then also very recently, as recent as I believe it was this past week, where there was a UN General Assembly vote, which condemned, again, Russian aggression in Ukraine. And towards that end, looking at the specifics of the vote of this region, by the way, it was the majority actually signed on and supported actually the condemnation. Nicaragua was the only country I saw that voted against. Cuba, interestingly enough, abstained, as did Honduras. And then there were some others just didn't show up for voting in this case. But the others that did show up for voting, in fact, voted to condemn the aggression. So political support matters, to answer your question. Secondly, there's the concern about, by the way, and I mentioned I was in Japan. I was in Japan because the Japanese are hosting the G7 meeting and the G20 meeting. And part of that discussion is not about military support, but actually about reconstruction, or the term that's used is the rebuilding, actually, of Ukraine. And towards that end, every country can have a role to play in this regard, no matter how small or how large. Supply chains have been affected, as we know. And in that regard, I do think that this region has a lot to offer in terms of the discourse of reconstruction, in terms of providing models of what works, what doesn't work. We mentioned environment earlier. I used to work on one area for this region, water. And I know that actually some countries that are more advanced in terms of their models of providing clean water to their communities. And by the way, Ukraine's water right now is just totally, totally impacted. So you can't imagine, everything here is on the table. So political support, certainly in the economic and, if you will, rebuilding lane, the region has a role to play.
And to get that political support and to get the region to play that role, policymakers have to understand why it's in their vital interest. You made the case for why it's in the vital interest of the United States. Why is it in the vital interest of smaller Latin American nations?
Well, that goes back to what the Japanese Prime Minister said. When he said, we're in Japan and this is so far away, why should we care? Because we're concerned about leaving it unaddressed, such blatant aggression, not doing anything, not having a global outcry. He made the point, this is not just Ukraine's fight. It's not just a transatlantic fight. It's a global fight. It has ramifications for every tyrant and aspiring tyrant who will look at this case and say, I get a pass. So it's in the regions at large and the global community at large, national interest. And I have to say, I think that Zelensky, I've been amazed. I've been in different parts of the world. I've been in the Middle East. I've been in Africa. I've been in other places. And I've always been amazed. He pops up and he's speaking to every audience. And it's actually a smart thing because he doesn't leave his public diplomacy to someone else. It's personal. But he's made the case very strongly. This is having a global impact politically, for the reason I mentioned, of any future aggression. And if it's unaddressed, it's also the moral issue in terms of the kind of, I will use personally the word genocide, because I mean, total villages and schools are just bombed randomly. And then you get into the third factor, the supply chains. Egypt, 75% of Egypt's grain comes from Ukraine. And I don't know if you know, also a sizable portion of China's grain actually comes from Ukraine. So all of these countries are impacted in different ways. It's in everyone's interest to put a stop to this and now.
So how does it end? What does success look like for Ukraine, for Russia, for the United States?
Well, let me first define it from what Ukraine says, because Ukraine basically says success for them means all Russian troops are off their sovereign territory. And that means not
Crimea
only,
as well?
you took the words out of my mouth, Carlos, Crimea, yes, not just only their sovereign main territory, but also Crimea. So that's number one. Number two, they also have asked for security assurances. I think all of you in this room know that there's been a debate over NATO. Ukraine wants to be in NATO. All right, but the question is, will they be embraced in NATO? And they have to go through steps in order to get there. So there have been others who've given the model of Israel and the kind of security assistance that the United States, for example, provides to Israel, that does this make sense as a model going forward for Ukraine? And then thirdly is part of the reconstruction, which already has begun, because it's not just giving military aid. There's already a lot of work afoot right now by multilateral institutions, individual countries, as well as private sector organizations and corporations. Because the argument is, let's not only win the battle, but it's also, militarily, but winning the peace. And it's an opportunity for eradication of corruption. By the way, in Ukraine, transparency to bolster investment, to also ensure that there's a modernization, a kind of digitalization. Energy, the whole energy domain has shifted and has changed as a result of this aggression, as we've seen. So here, the bottom line is all of these areas matter for success. That's what they have wanted. As for Russia, there already are procedures with regard to two things. One, the War Crimes Tribunal. We already know the statement made by the ICC, but let me focus on the US. The Department of Justice has actually a unit that has been established to focus specifically, singularly on war crimes in Ukraine, meaning here Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And then secondly, there's the issue also of the seizing of Russian assets as part of reparations, as part of the conclusion and the outcome here. And towards this end, I noticed that the Biden administration just released a statement, I believe it was either this week or last, in which it stated that it will seek to look into this very seriously, this issue. You may have noticed that there have been some previous officials, Larry Summers, who was the Secretary of Treasury, along with Robert Zoellick, former Deputy Secretary of State and head of the U.S. Trade, or the USTR, Trade Representative's Office. They have been pushing very strongly for this. You might have also noticed the General Assembly backed it. When there was a vote, should there be such reparations and seizure of Russian assets, it was overwhelmingly supported. But let me just add two things, because his question is not an easy one. I mentioned what Ukraine wants. And I personally, I think their request and what they want and what they've put forward is reasonable. I will say, well, this will be what will come forward. I think in the time ahead, we have to see, will there be a sustained level of fighting? Will there be what constitutes a kind of gray zone in Ukraine established, which would be the worst of all worlds, I'd say, in the sense that it remains as devastated and as destructive, internally, and no infrastructure. And Russia wants to see a war of attrition. Russia would like to see this not end. And then there's the third, because you said victory for Russia. I don't see a victory here for Russia. If there is a victory here for Russia, that would be a very sad state of affairs. And I certainly hope we don't come to that, because already I think I've tried to very succinctly describe the global ramifications of such a victory. And if it's left punished, there's no punitive action that's taken. The term is, about never again, never again. I mean, what's taking place, we should not witness never again.
But if there's going to be a negotiated solution, Russia has to feel that it gets something out of it, right?
Yes, and that's where diplomats come in. There are many diplomats in this room, and I think the diplomatic community has been looking at, this issue right now on negotiations. I will say, I think it's going to be a very difficult road to move forward on. Why? First, because Ukraine wants to be in a position of leverage. If you have Russian troops and it's a kind of a gray zone, what's your leverage in getting your territory back? And that's one thing they're adamant about, is their territory back, including Crimea. Secondly is, all right, how do you work this in a way in which it comes to some kind of ending? It's hard to envision that at this point through a negotiation without some major concession by Ukraine. And Ukraine is the one that, basically has to make that call, because it was the one that was not only attacked, but I didn't even mention the thousands of children that have been abducted and taken into Russia. I don't know if you saw the outcome of the appeal to Xi Jinping. Zelensky specifically asked Xi Jinping, could you push Putin to get our children back? We want our children back. And that was one of the requests made, at least publicly. It was said that one of the requests that had been made. There isn't a simple answer to your question, but my own particular vote is on the first outcome, because I think the outcome is not only good for Ukraine, it's good for the transatlantic community, for Europe, those countries like Sweden, Finland, that in my lifetime, if you had asked me, I never thought they would have joined NATO. Honestly, and they did. Why? Because they're concerned. Again, not to only mention you again, but Dazdi mentioned cyber. It's not just only about the military, but Estonia, the Baltic countries have been cyber attacked by Russia. Ukraine's been cyber attacked. Sweden's been cyber attacked by Russia. So we want an outcome that is good, not just for Ukraine, the transatlantic community, but the global community, that will thwart future such blatant aggressions, and also ensure that those that took these actions, like Putin, the appropriate actions are taken against Russia in this case, and those who are guilty for what unfolded here.
To prevent it from happening again.
Correct.
We have a couple of minutes left, so I want to give them over to you so that you can impart any words of wisdom you have, anything that's on your mind, anything that you want to close with in the next couple of minutes.
Well, I
All
think
yours.
the most important, but you really gave me a very good platform to do it earlier. The thing that I think I will reiterate is about the importance of our hemisphere. I had, during my time, global issues when I was an undersecretary, and I was dealing with this hemisphere in every capacity you could imagine. I was dealing with refugee issues. I was dealing with human rights issues, environmental issues. I had INL, International Narcotics Law Enforcement, which was also front and center. I had science. I had women's issues. I could go on, but it really was transnational. And towards that end, I think that there's a lot that could be done in the region of a creative nature. Some ways, I think, and there are some places where there are barriers, but that doesn't mean that there might not be some other ways in which one can work effectively. But I think the most important element that we've had out of this conversation would be 2 points. The first one is the region matters, and we should care about it and think about ways forward politically, economically, militarily. It shouldn't be on the back burner or put to the side. And then secondly, the issue about Ukraine, because your question about why does it matter? The issue about a blank check and about American concerns. We should put our own domestic concerns before us. They matter, of course, but that doesn't mean that other events such as this one do not also affect us directly. It does. And in this case, I think we're doing the right thing of providing military support, ensuring that there's a network of international support behind Ukraine. I'd like to see it further and faster in terms of what's needed. But it's also not just the here and now, it is also looking at that momentum going forward of reconstruction and rebuilding. So that would be my last point of reiteration. It does matter. We're not immune from such egregious actions that take place and not too far from us.
And I would say those who believe that we need to focus on what's happening in the US have a legitimate point. I think the point, what those who believe that we need to have a more active role need to do is explain why it is in America's vital interest
I will
to get involved.
I will give a little criticism and then one parting note for FIU. A little criticism, and I've heard this. I personally, I'm a strong believer in having more communication to the American public. And even if it might be negative or positive, I think that the challenges of explaining very complex situations. The situation in Ukraine is a very complex one, and there's so many factors. And even when you ask me the question about outcome, it's hard to define that because there are different sort of elements as to what people see as potential outcomes. I focused on the outcome that I think is most crucial here because it will have positive consequences for all. Other outcomes, gray zone or off ramps, have negative consequences associated with them. So in terms of the American public, I think it's absolutely essential to have more public diplomacy, a more explanation of what it is we're doing and why. Because I think the American public, I'm at least heartened when I go around the United States, not even speaking to people, I'm always amazed at just seeing the Ukrainian flag everywhere. That's a sign of support that a lot of people have. And even, without necessarily some deep explanation, because they do see certain kinds of video clips of horrific, what's happening and which is so horrific, just to basic, individuals, human beings who aren't political, and this is not their fight, and they're being massacred. But FIU, may I end on this note? first of all, I'm very delighted to be here. Last semester, I was a senior fellow in, a senior leadership fellow in the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. And I just want to commend not only the center, but FIU really for the growth that I've seen. I also was here a number of years back, pre-COVID, because there was a foreign policy conference that used to also take place annually, which was great fun. But FIU is really growing. It's exciting. I felt very energized by the students who I had in my class here at FIU last semester. And all I could say as my parting note is keep it up, keep moving forward. All of these centers and the sponsors for today matter. And your students are really going on to doing great things. So just keep it up.
And I think the people in this room and those watching online have realized why we're so thrilled to have you at the center, not only as a senior leadership fellow in the fall, but now as a member of our board of advisors. So thank you so much for your time and thank you for being with us.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.